Good morning, Zera Shimshon, Parshas Bo. We're on page Taf Kuf Pei Aleph. Okay, so it's an interesting verse that he's quoting here. We are in Yud Gimel. I'll read to you the full verse and then we'll understand his question better. The Torah is talking about the obligation of the Jewish people to bring the Korban Pesach. And the Torah tells us we should shech the Korban Pesach, then they should take the blood and put it on the two doorposts and on the lintel of the door. And then you should eat the meat of this Korban. V'achlu, the Torah says, V'achlu es abasar, they shall eat the meat balayla hazeh on this night. Tzli eish, roasted in fire. Umatzos, al marorim yochluhu. With matzos, on maror, they shall eat it. So that, again, what the Torah tells us, is you take the Korban Pesach, you put the blood on the doorposts, you eat the meat, roasted in fire, with matzos, and on moror you should eat it. That's what the verse says. So he says, Yesh l'daktig, I have a question. Lama kan hifseg akasu v'matzos min moror? Why separate the matzah from the moror and say, with matzos, on moror you shall eat it? Now, that wouldn't be so difficult, because maybe that's how you should eat it, except that it would parshas b'haloscha hismicha. Later in the Torah, when the Torah describes the eating of the Korban Pesach, the Torah puts them together, the chsiv al matzos umarorim yochlu, meaning with matzah and maror, which is where we get Hillel's korech, Hillel's sandwich, which is really a wrap, where we would wrap the matzah, because in those days matzah wasn't a hard, crunchy thing, it was much more like pita, so they would wrap the matzah around the maror and eat it, but the point is that later the Torah is going to describe it as one entity, and here the Torah seems to separate them and make them into two separate things. With matzos on maror you shall eat it.
Sophia makes the matzah that way.
What?
Sophia can make the matzah that way, that you can wrap it.
You have a matzah like that?
She does.
Oh, okay. You have a softer matzah?
No, I don't.
No, you make that wet matzah that you can roll up.
You wet it, yeah. We wet it a little bit.
Yeah.
We soak it.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, but it's not made that way. It's not the original, because you wouldn't be able to soak
It's
your
not
matzah.
soft bread.
No, but that's what it was in the old days. It was a soft bread.
Oh.
How did they do that? I mean, I thought you weren't supposed to,
close.
the brach.
Yemenite, they do that. Yemenite,
Well, the Sephardim don't have the rules of Gebraks.
Yeah.
Oh,
Do you hear?
Right.
Yemenites make
The
it
Yemenite,
soft.
they have a soft
Yeah, they probably still have it that way. Because the reason why we don't do that is because we're so paranoid that we don't know how to bake it properly, that we just make it hard and crunchy like that, because then we're guaranteed that nothing rose. But technically, if you could have it a little thicker and put it in the oven before 18 minutes and make sure that it's baked fully, you could have a soft matzah. So that's what they had. Anyway.
But how do you put matzah on moror? It's usually the other way around. You put the moror on the
the
matzah.
Korban Pesach is on the matzah. It's on the matzah and the maror. The Korban Pesach becomes part of that sandwich. We just don't have that in our sandwich. We're missing the Korban Pesach.
Well, of course, you can't do it. Matzos al mororim.
Umatzos, with matzahs on maror. It's referring back to the Korban Pesach.
The moror is on the Korban
The
Pesach.
Korban Pesach is on the maror. So they have the bread.
Matzah, moror, Korban Pesach.
Yeah, lamb right off the rotisserie.
Someone last year gave a shiur at Torah, and he talked about how fatty meats like lamb, when you put the maror and the matzah, you put the maror on it, it like enhances the flavor of fatty meat. It was a culinary thing, that was his take. It was more of a culinary thing, and it actually worked. The way he described it, it worked. But
Okay.
that was his take on it.
All right, that's good. No, it's
He
got
wrote a book on it.
Right. I wouldn't say that God is giving us recipes, but I would
Right.
say the other way. That
I
no,
know, that's
but
what
it would be
it
true
sounded
the other
that
way, that if it is a mitzvah, it should work with every aspect of the creation,
It should be
and then yeah, there we go. Okay, but Od Kasha, second difficulty.
Depends what they use for more.
Well, that's true too, but they probably used the original romaine lettuce.
Yeah.
What's
Yeah.
the original one? Or some
Well,
kind of
you know,
lettuce?
there's a
And
question
guys.
about the leaves and whatever. All right, getting into a separate discussion. But Odkash, here's another difficulty. Lama chazar lomar yachluhu. Furthermore, why does the Torah say, you shall eat the meat on this night, roasted in fire, with matzos and maror, you shall eat it. There's a second, you shall eat it, at the end of the verse. Miach Shamid already says, v'achlu asabasa, you should eat the meat, tzlieh, shumatzos al marorim, sagi, that's enough. Okay, so now he's going to go to all kinds of places, and I hope we have an opportunity to get through at least most of this. But he just has a number of explanations that he's going to weave us through. So let's start off with this famous teaching, which all the Mefarshim suggest. And I've discussed this many times, which he has in these parshios. She'im Yisrael hayum nis'akvim b'Mitzrayim atashlum hazman. If the Jewish people would have stayed in Egypt for the full 400 years, lo hayutzrichim legalios acheros, there would not have been any need for any other exiles. Even though we understand that the 400 years starts from Yitzchak and that it means this, it means that, all that is a reinterpretation in order to justify the verses. But technically, according to the original requirement, we were actually supposed to be enslaved for 400 years. And had we fulfilled it on that level, there would have been no more exiles. The Jewish people would have been completely purified.
Well, then assuming they didn't drop in levels of tumor?
Well, as you say, that's the problem. The problem is,
So why was it case? That's not case. That's
Well-
like, why was it case? That's not really case. That's not really.
so HaKadosh Baruch Hu, that's why we say in the Haggadah, HaKadosh Baruch Hu chishev es haketz. God recalculated and said, fine, you guys can't handle, which we'll talk about in a minute, you guys can't handle, so you know what, we're gonna count the 400 from Yitzchak, and then you guys will have to make it up.
We made it up 3 times already.
I know. That's
Well,
what-
let's see what he says. Had we done the full 400 years, no nation, no language would have overcome us. But we had to leave before the time. We were already in the 49th level of Tumah. We allowed ourselves to fall so far that we couldn't handle 400 years in Egypt, and God had to press, so to speak, the eject button and call it early. There's a consequence of that. As it says, in a rush, in a hurry, you had to leave Egypt. That's why we have all these further exiles. Except, he says, when we came to Har Sinai, and that would be 50 days later, well, we came to Har Sinai 44 days later, but Nasan Lahem Aluchos, when we got the Luchos, at that point the Torah refers to the Luchos as Charus. Charus means etched, but Charus also means Cherus, freedom. Cherus,
Charoset is from that?
or maybe, but it's one's with a tough, one's with a samach, but I'm sure you could relate them. So Cherus mi malach hamaves, we were free of the angel of death, umishibud malchius, and that we were never going to be enslaved, because here, get this, Hashem was so merciful that He said, even though you're coming out early, if you can manage to make it all the way till the luchos make it down, that will be your second redemption, and that will guarantee your freedom. Right? So Hashem says, listen, you're supposed to be 400 years. You're supposed to be 400 years in exile. If you do that, it's over. No more exiles, no more difficulties, no more troubles. Even the Erev Rav would have been fully fixed, had they been allowed, the Jews been allowed in Egypt, and they would have come out, they would have been righteous people, the Jewish people would have lived happily ever after. But they couldn't. We reached the 49th level of Tumah, and Hashem had to make a choice, let the Jewish people fall in or take them out, and Hashem took us out. So now we're going to have to suffer all these other exiles. So God, still in His infinite mercy, said, you know what? I'm going to give them this tool that's going to allow them to be freed, a second chance to be freed of all exiles. I'm going to give them the luchos. So here's what we're going to do. After 50 days, we're going to have a Matan Torah. I'm going to give them the Ten Commandments. Then I'm going to call up Moshe and say, guys, just hold on for 40 more days. If you can make it 40 days, then I'm going to bring down the luchos with the Ten Commandments on it. And at that point, with the luchos in your possession, you will be on such a high level that that too will free you from any future exiles. Right, hours before. A few hours. So then we had another chance. If we had just not sinned with the egel, we would have had eternal freedom. As I wrote earlier in Parashat Shemos, that Moshe was saying, don't mention the other exiles, because if they don't mess up, they won't have any more exiles. If they wouldn't have sinned, so basically, what Hashem would have said, if we would have not have sinned with the egel, Hashem would have said, now you have the luchos, you have the cheres, you have the freedom. So how are we going to count the 400 years? We're going to count from Yitzchak. What about the suffering? Well, they had extra suffering. God would have allowed all that to count within that system of accounting. So he says, that's what the Mefarshim write. And he says, I have a problem with that. I don't understand this. If we're saying that God is going to count the extra suffering, because as we know, Hashem said to Abraham, they will suffer and they will be enslaved. But Hashem didn't say to Abraham that they're going to be throwing babies into the river. Hashem never said to Abraham that they're going to be sticking children into the wall. So we say that extra suffering that we suffered makes up for the lost time. So he says, if that's true, then we should not have gotten, we shouldn't need 400 years. If we suffered more than we needed to in Egypt, then we shouldn't need to make up a full 400 years. If we need punishment, we should have had some other punishment. But if all we needed was 400 years in Egypt, and they, embittered our lives more than they should, so that should count. We already finished the enslavement. There's no more need for enslavement. If God takes us into exile, that means that God is saying that the extra difficult suffering we had does not make up for the 400 years. Then why would it have helped if we received the luchos? And we didn't do the egel. We didn't finish. How can one thing make up for the other? Listen, if we're supposed to do 400 years, and if you don't do 400 years, there's going to be more exiles, then how could the luchos save you from that? And if you'll say that if you can make it all the way to the luchos, then I'm going to count the extra suffering in Egypt to make up the 400 years. If the extra suffering makes it up, then we shouldn't need any more exile. If it doesn't make it up, then how does the luchos help? The whole thing is confusing. It sounds like we are borrowing from one account to pay another account, and they don't fit, right? You wouldn't allow this kind of accounting?
No, I would
not.
Right? But wait a minute. Hashem set this whole thing up. It's like, can Hashem pick up the rock that's too heavy, whatever it is.
Yeah, but it's got to follow the rules. So what's the logic to say, well, you know what? You worked extra hard, that can make up, but only if you make it to the luchos. Then if you make it to the luchos, then we'll count the suffering as extra time. Either it does or it doesn't.
It sounds like the Jews are bargaining. That's not God.
Well, we'll see. We'll see. He's going to make a system out of it. Yesh Lomar. So I'd like to suggest like this: the vadai afilu below koshi ashibud hayalam lipater megalios acheres. He says, incredible pshat I've never seen anyone suggest before. This is the power of the Zera Shimshon to just pull these ideas from out of nowhere. He says, I want to suggest, he says, that even without the difficult extra work, once they come out of Egypt, there should be no more exiles. The Hachit Name Perigimel Lemakos. We have a rule. This is a rule everywhere that God follows the laws of the Torah. In fact, sometimes, in order for Hashem to interact with us, He has to wait for the sages to give rulings in certain areas, and then Hashem follows those rules. That's a rule which we find everywhere in the Torah, that Hashem follows the rules of the Torah. And there's a rule. Amduhu lekabel arba'im. Before, they would give 40 lashes, which is really 39 lashes. 39 lashes is not the amount that's given, that's the maximum amount given. But before a person was given lashes, they would have to see a doctor. And the doctor would assess how many lashes that person can handle. If the doctor said that the person can only handle 20 lashes, then we would only give 18. They have to be numbers, multiples of 3. So we would only give 18 lashes to that person. If the doctor says the person can handle 30, we would give the person 30 lashes. The doctor would decide. What happens, but they also kept the doctor, it's incredible, they kept the doctor over the process. So the doctor said he can handle all 39. Laka miktsas. And in the middle of the lashes, this person starts to go. For Amr, the doctor says, She'eni yachal lekabel arba'im, he can't handle 40. The halacha is pater. Even though the person is supposed to get 40, if the doctor says, stop, he can't handle anymore, it's not that we stop, let the person recover. The person gets whatever the doctor says, and that's the punishment. Says the Zera Shimshon, if that's the halacha in our courts, the same must apply above. V'hachinami Yisrael, when the Jewish people were first assessed, under HaKadosh Baruch Hu im Avraham, Hashem stood with our grandfather Avraham and made an assessment. Sheyuchlu lekabel agalios shel arba me'os shana. He said the Jewish people are going to handle, they can take it, 400 years should be enough to cover the punishment, whatever needs to be done. And then we are there after 210 years, and we can't handle anymore. We're about to drop. We're about to be lost into the tumah. And God calls it. He says, stop. They can't handle anymore. Peturim legamri, we should be exempt. That's the law of the Torah.
But not on a physical level? With the suffering, physical
No,
suffering?
it's the equivalent. Whatever is the equivalent. So then there should be no further punishment. Hashem, the great doctor, assessed and saw that the Jewish people had reached the limit of what they can handle, and the halacha is that if a person is in that state, if they gave a number of what's necessary, and he's reached his limit, then that's all the person can handle. So what's the answer? And this kind of gets into what you're saying. But it's not the same. Because when the person's receiving the lashes, and they get up to 25, and the doctor says, stop, you can't handle anymore. Why can't he handle anymore?
Because he's going to die.
Why?
It's too much. It's too much for his body.
It's too much for his body. In other words, the assessment was an incorrect assessment.
The original
assessment.
Yeah, when the doctor said...
So Hashem doesn't make any mistakes?
Well, one second, let's see.
But he was judging the Jews.
One second, let's see the way he says it.
Circumstances change, though.
Well, we'll see. The Hasan b'malkus ha'ones she'eni yachal lekabel. The reason why the person is unable to handle the lashes, b'machmas hateva shelo, was because of the person's nature. Shenischalish, he became weak. Ve'elo shum tzabshia, but he didn't do anything to cause himself to not be able to handle those lashes. Mishum hachi pater, and that's why he's exempt, because it wasn't his fault. In other words, if this person would put salt on his back the day before, or whatever else would hurt the skin, and that wouldn't be the same, right? So if he didn't do it of his own, it's just his body is weak and he can't handle it. It's not that the Jewish people were too weak to handle it. God didn't make a mistake in the assessment of 400 years. They allowed themselves to become connected to the Tumah.
Allowed themselves, or because the Mitzrayim were extra in the
Well,
punishment.
that's the next paragraph. He's going to get to that.
okay.
Ubezeh yesh them k'tzas pshia. So there's some fault.
Yeah.
There's some fault in the Jewish people. They should have been careful not to be affected and allow themselves to fall to 49. Yeah, we're following a chain here of a processing. So he's saying, no. Here it's not quite the same. Here you're not exempt by getting a partial because they allowed themselves to become weakened and put themselves in that state. But maybe not, which is what you were saying. The Jewish people have an excuse, lomar, to say, shekoshi ashibud gar lahem kach. It's because the Egyptians, the reason why they were falling so hard is because the Egyptians raised the level of the suffering. They couldn't handle it anymore. They broke us. Ukudamrina b'medrash, as the Medrash tells us, she'amar Michael l'sarei ha'umos, that when the angels were arguing, why should we split the sea for these idol worshippers and those idol worshippers? They both worshipped idols. Michael says, "Klum avdu avad Yisrael avad zara." The Jewish people don't worship idols. They only did it b'Mitzrayim in Egypt mitoch tiruf hadas, because you drove them mad. You made them insane. When a person is feeling all that suffering and they don't know what to do, they lose their mind. That's why they went there. Mitoch ha'onis shal shibud, they were under duress of the enslavement. Mitoch dochik. So therefore, let's trace this, and you'll see the brilliance of what the Zera Shimshon just did. Again, the question was, what this whole funny accounting that he's doing. So he says like this: technically, if a person is assessed by the Beis Din to get 40, and after 25 the doctor says no more, it's not just that the person is we stop at 25. That's all. He's done. He does not owe the other 14 at all. So here, when Hashem calls it after 210, it should be over. There should be no more exile. But that's only true if the 25 that the doctor calls is because the person hasn't been doing something to cause him to not be able to. But here the Jewish people allowed themselves to be caught in the Tumah by worshiping the idols of the Egyptians. But the answer is, but the response to that would be, well, the Jewish people were forced to go there. They were driven so mad by the Egyptians, they never wanted to worship idols. They had no interest in idols. They were just doing that because they were completely under the duress and oppression of the Egyptians. He says of Zenicha, and that was all good, im lo yechtu be'egel, till they sinned with the egel.
Because there was no pressure that day.
Right. The golden calf causes the reassessment of the entire story.
But they were also under duress there. They were their leader.
But not the Egyptian, not the enslavement. Right.
But they weren't under duress.
So he says, "Avakashachatu be'egel." Once they sin with the golden calf, this is brilliant, right? Igloi Milsalam Afreya. They've now retold the story. Shahayiritzaona b'avodah zarah. It means that under certain circumstances, even without the enslavement, they were also leaning towards idol worship. Ba'af b'Mitzrayim, then they lose their excuse in Egypt. So even in Egypt, they can't say they only did it under the pressure and the enslavement. It means they had some will towards it.
Is there some principle of halacha between a whole number and a tenth of the number? Because like 400 to 40, if you make it 400, well, you're good. Well, now that you've gone to this level, if you make it to 40, you're good. So what is the...
There's certainly a correlation. And the fact that it's
something.
Yeah, and the fact that it's 40 lashes too, 39 lashes, there's all that is connected. But that would be a whole separate discussion. Yeah, we could give a 6-hour lecture on just the number 40 in the Torah,
I think there is some contradiction maybe. At one time we said that they will redeem because of the 5 mitzvot that they keep, closing, name, or no national, all of this. But that's what because of they redeem. Now you're saying that no, because they redeem because they didn't reach that 49 level of tumah. So what was exactly?
Well, it actually works together. What we're saying is that the Jewish people were being pulled out early. They needed to be there for 400 years, and Hashem is calling a special emergency exodus in order to get the Jewish people out. But even now, they have to have some merit. So Hashem quickly gives them 2 mitzvot of Pesach and Milah, and add to that the fact that they kept their names and their language and their clothing. So they have to have some merit in order to continue to be the Jewish people. But it's still an emergency.
Evacuation.
Emergency exit.
Emergency birth.
Okay.
Just induction, which is early, and the Jewish people are really not ready for it.
It's just hard to believe that extreme, that 48 level of tumor. What was it?
We would have 49, yeah. If we would have reached 50, we would have been lost.
What were we doing besides?
He's saying worshiping idols. We were lost in that idol worship. I say all that was a good excuse. We were under pressure, we were under duress, until 40 days later we do the Egel. Hashem says, well, there goes your excuse. And now that you don't have an excuse, it's now your fault for leaving early. If it's your fault for leaving early, now you've got to make up the
The
exile.
angels were right then. Why did the sea split for them?
Well, at the time that the sea split, they still had the excuse.
They didn't have the Egel yet.
They didn't do the Egel. This is right. He quotes an interesting Gemara in Avodah Zarah. The Amar Achmanav Ashereim Tisrfum Be'esh. The Torah tells us that when we arrive in Eretz Yisrael, we have to burn all the Asherah trees, which are this Avodah Zarah. We have to burn them in fire. Asks the Gemara asks a difficult question, and a very interesting question. The halacha is that this would be the most terrible thing to do, right? The halacha is, what do you have to do to something that's Avodah Zarah? Destroy it. So why don't, if I see my neighbor has a brand new Lamborghini, I don't like that my neighbor has it, why don't I go outside and bow down to it and worship as a god, and now he has to destroy his Lamborghini? Right, what's the answer? The answer is we have a rule. Ein adam oser davar she'eno shelo. You can't prohibit something that isn't yours. You can't affect something. There's some exceptions, but the kinds of prohibitions which occur through my actions of mine that affect something, I can never do that to someone else's property. So if I put water into your flour right before Pesach and it becomes chametz, that's chametz because it's physically chametz. But if it's avodah zarah, which is through my mind that I'm affecting it, so you can't do that to someone else's property. Asks the Gemara, if that's true, why should we have to burn down the trees? Since this land belongs to us from our forefathers, they should have no power to affect idol worship on our objects. That's the question that the Gemara asks.
It's like leaving cigarettes in front of a guy who quit smoking. You can't have the temptation of having that tree near you because you've already shown that you have this propensity.
But he's going to say, the Gemara says even more than that. It's a question of ownership. He says, "Midapolchul Yisrael le'egel," because the halacha is, as soon as the Jewish people bow to the egel, galu adatay denichalu b'avodah zarah, that means that they do want avodah zarah. Chi asu nachem shlechusa didu avet, and then they become our messengers. In other words, if my neighbor does worship idols, and then I might be able to prohibit his car as his messenger. That's what the Gemara says. And therefore the Gentiles who were worshipping idols in Eretz Yisrael became the messengers of the Jewish people at the moment that they did the Egel. His point is not really that point. He's just borrowing the concept and saying, "Mishum hachi la'acha shechatu be'egel." So once we sin with the egel, nigzir aleim laredis begalias acheres. Now we have to have all these other exiles. Lefi shelo ishlimu ha'arba me'as shana shal galus Mitzrayim, because we didn't finish the 400 years of the exile. This is all just a setup to where he's going with the matzah and the maror, which we'll get to soon. But the point is, right now, this is a pshat just on its own, that the concept of the egel wasn't just a sin to itself. And all the commentaries ask, the Gemara tells us that, when you sin with the egel, now you will be punished with all these exiles. What's the connection between egel and the exiles? According to this, the egel is the undoing of the defense of the Jewish people, and that's why they're going back into exile. But no doubt we know, Shahamatzah uzecher lecherus. We know we're going to have Pesach coming in 3 months. Yep. It's coming. 2 months. What?
2 months. Yeah.
2 months. Thank you. Right. 2 months in a week. Shamatzah hu zecher lecheres. Matzah is a commemoration of the freedom. V'hamoror, I think everyone's done a Pesach Seder by now. Hu zecher leshibud represents the enslavement. V'hamagid hipech haseder. So you ever notice how in the Seder you actually do them in the wrong order? Shahayla Lomar, he says, Kol mi shelo amar shlosha devarim b'Pesach, whoever does not mention these three things, lo yatsa yidei chava, so ve'elu hein, Pesach, matzah, maror. But what does it say? What it should have said is, Pesach, maror, and matzah. Maror comes before matzah. Pesach, matzah,
Tomorrow
maror.
should come before Pesach.
Because the
Yeah.
because the Eagles of came after.
Well, we'll see. Elalashmianu, shebishvil, so he explains like this. Sheyatzu b'chipazon, we left in a hurry. And mishemhachi afu also abatzek matzos. Why do we eat matzah? Because, why do we say in the Seder, why do we eat matzah?
Because we had to
Because
leave
they
in a hurry.
left in a hurry.
We left in a hurry. And we didn't have time for the dough to rise, and that's why we eat matzah. Why are you leaving in a hurry?
Exactly.
Because Hashem said, let's get going.
Why?
We had plans.
Because of this
thinking
woman.
so-
Because we were on the 49th level of Tumah.
I thought at that point the Mitzrayim chased us out.
Why were they chasing us out? Because God arranged for the speeding up of the process. K'dichsiv ki lo chametz, you couldn't make it chametz. Ki garshu, because you were kicked out. V'lo yachlu ismai, you couldn't delay. Hanish lo shlima zman, meaning you didn't leave on time, you left early. And because you left early, mishum hachi yesh lanu maror, that's why we have maror, the hainu galiyas acher is the future exiles. What an amazing pshat in the Seder. Pesach, Hashem passed over our houses. And then Matzah, the next day we left in a hurry, we left early. And because we left early, we didn't make up that time. That's why Maror, we're in exile today. As we've explained. So this is beautiful now. The next time the Torah talks about eating Pesach, Matzah, and Maror, the first time that it's written in Parshas Bo, it's before the Egel, while we are still not going to have any more exiles. The next time it's written is Parshas Bahaloscha, when we've already sinned with the Egel, and the whole system is different. So he says, the second year, Kvar Asu Egel, they already did the Egel, Ksiv Sham, there it says, Al Matzos Umerorim Yachlu, eat the matzah and the maror together. Sha Matzos Umerorim Akolu Tam Echad, because they're both, the matzah and the maror, both represent the same idea. Sha Matzos Morim Shiyoyu Kodem Zmanam, the matzah represents leaving early. So the matzah and maror work together like they do for us in our Seder. On the Pesach Mitzrayim, but in Egypt, the matzah did not represent the haste. Because at that point they might not have sinned again. In which case, the difficulty of the servitude would have counted. We would not have needed any other exiles. So the matzah and maror don't work together. The matzah represents the full, complete 400 years. Incredible pshat. There, the matzah is only redemption. Not the hurrying. Because had the Jewish people not sinned with the Egel, they would not have been considered leaving early. We would have counted the extra difficulty of the servitude for the 400 years.
So we say Maror first because now we're in an exile and Matzah for the future redemption. That's why we say it in that order.
Oh, when we're saying matzah, we left in a hurry,
Right, but now
and therefore maror. Well, we say matzah before maror, right? Because for
That was
us,
for the first year.
right, the matzah, right? No, that's afterwards. We are after the egel. So after the egel, the matzah changed. Instead of the matzah representing freedom like it did in Egypt,
that would be Maror and Matzah.
right there would be maror and matzah. Instead, the matzah represents our failure to survive all of Egypt, and we had to leave early, which allows for maror, the future exiles.
We only have to make them 190 years, right?
Well, the counting is different. Once you pay your taxes late, you're going to be paying more than the 190. Right.
What I mean, how do
That's ribbies.
2.5%.
how do you
Right.
how do you compute the?
We don't know. If we knew that computer, we would know when the exile is going to end. But we've had 70 years in Babylon, and 52 in Persia, and 180 in Greece, and we're approaching 2,000 years in Edom. And at this point, we're wondering, God needs a new accountant.
Maybe we're not on the 49th level.
So, Hashem can see the whole thing, right?
Yep.
Hashem knows because In Shemayim there is no time.
Right.
So this experience or this creation, Hashem saw the beginning to the end. So he knew that we're gonna do Cheton Eight.
Free will is free will.
No. Why? He knew that we're gonna do it, right?
No, that's free will.
He knew all the permutations of what could happen, but he didn't.
We have free will. We could have chosen not to do the egel. That's the power of free will. God doesn't affect it. So we could have chosen
I know
otherwise.
that God would not affect it, but God knew that we're gonna do it.
Yeah, but God, that doesn't change things. This is the free will versus God's omniscience. God behaves as if He doesn't know. He lets us choose. That's the system.
Yeah, Rabbi, somebody gave you a little explanation. Okay, today's February 6th, right?
Right.
Okay, okay, whatever it is. What will you have for dinner 1 year from now in 2018? You don't know. You're going to have the free will. God knows what you're going to decide to have for dinner 1 year from now.
Right.
Yeah.
Right, but I still get to choose.
Yes.
Right. So that's the power here. Okay, let's go on. V'zeu, that's why the Torah says, V'achlu es abasar balayla azet tzli eish. You should eat it roasted in fire. Umatzos, with matzos representing the freedom. But harder custom the Torah separates al marorim yachlu with the maror, because originally matzah and maror were not meant to work together. Matzah completely represented freedom, and maror completely represented servitude, and there was no mixing of them
So
together.
why does Hillel want you to eat them together? What is he saying? He's saying
It changes. Now it changes,
So
right?
that's why
Kamosha
you do it
Pirish Rashi Zam, Zeichel Yumaru Es Chayein, the Maru represented the bitterness. Then Achila Acheres Muvsekas Muvdelis Min Arishon. The Maru is separate from the Pesach and the Matzah, which represent freedom. But then it changes. When we mess up, and when we sin with the Egel, at that point, wait, you did the egel, that means you left early, and now the matzah represents your leaving in a panic and a rush of the pressing of the button early, which causes you to experience more exiles. Now the matzah has an element of punishment in it, and that's why discussing this in the Friday night class, that the fact that matzah is called lechem oni and lechem ani, oni representing the freedom and the speaking about our experience, while it's ani, it's the poor man's bread, and the matzah is both in it. Matzah was just supposed to be the symbol of freedom, and now by messing this up, we've ruined the matzah. And now we are carrying the matzah. So everyone asks the famous question. I'm sure you've heard this before 1,000 times. And if you remember this, it'll be a good thing on its own to say over at the Seder. Everyone asks the question. We say at the Seder, why do we eat matzah? Because we had no time for the dough to rise and we left. Then why did they eat matzah in Egypt the night before? Now you know the answer. Because it wasn't supposed to be matzah representing the dough and leaving early. Matzah is supposed to be the symbol of freedom. And that's what they did. The next day, we came out and the matzah didn't have time to rise. And then 90 days later, 89 days later, when we sinned with the golden calf, that retroactively said, 1 second, now your matzah is actually a cause for further exiles.
So the
leaving
three
early.
matzahs we have, one is for the potential that it was the cherus, one is because we messed up, and you need a motzedach in aretz, so you break one in half so you can have two.
You could
Is that what that
you could
is?
try to go that
I'm
way.
not going that way, I'm asking you.
He's not suggesting anything like that. All right? Let's see if we can just do a little more here. If you take a look in the Torah, you'll see Moshe tells the Jewish people to put the blood on the lintel and the two doorposts. But Hashem told him otherwise. It says in the Torah, first you should put on the two doorposts and then the lentils. So to get into this, I'd like to talk a little bit about this mitzvah. Why do they need this sign? Why put it on 3 places on the door? Why couldn't they just put a red mark in the middle of the door, like Alibaba, and that would be enough of a sign not to go into this door? So you could see the blood, and skip over those houses, Shem or Shumim, whichever has the blood on it. So our sages tell us, Shem Keneged Avos, that it represents Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. Moshe, Aaron, and Miriam. Okay, but I still don't find this difficult. Why are we making symbols on the door? The point is just a marker to tell God this is a house of Jews. Also, the law was that for each marking, You had to have a separate dipping of the paintbrush into the blood, and then smearing and then dipping again. You can't dip it once and then mark 3 times. Each time you have to dip it again. Okay, so we're not going to get through this whole thing, but let's just try to do what we can here. We know Egypt was the place of sorcery. That the Egyptians used sorcery to bind the Jews. It wasn't just that they had an army to keep the Jews in, but they actually used magic to protect Egypt. Up until now, a slave was unable to leave Egypt. They left 600,000. Some say that that's what the Sphinx were, that these were these giant creatures which at that point, through their magic, were animated, and they kept the Jews from leaving, and some say they're shaped like dogs, and that's the barking dogs. Anyway, he says, but the real sorcery, if you want to do sorcery over someone, the easiest way to do it is over a house. Because your house is your channel for mazel and success. This is why it's very important to treat the sanctity of your house and to have everything the shalom bayis, right? Through a house, through a child, through a wife, there can be, that's where the mazel comes from. And the main place of the sorcery is always the door of the house. The Zohar tells us there's a certain evil spirit, the Shari Bein Taru, which can affect the doors, the Islan Kamazin Bishim, which can do many harmful things. That's where the demons can enter the house, only through the doors.
Wait a minute, is that like in Bereshis when your evil is waiting for you at the door?
Right. All the things associated with the door, it's because magic is through the door. The mazel that comes is through a house, and specifically through the door. That's why we have a mitzvah, to place Hashem's name on the door. The which is our faith and belief in God, and where we have the name of God and we believe in the name of God, holy bad things can't happen there. And it can't affect people. As it says, no bad will come to you, and no calamity will befall your tent. Which is why we have the name of God on the outside. Shem Shin Daled and the Yud of the name Shaka of the mezuzah. Hashem Shumashadid Marachas Hashem Ksilan, because Shaka Shin Daled Yud represents Shidud, or God's control or rearrangement of the spheres. The Einod Mavado for the Kshafim, and God is greater than the Vachinami B'Tzis Mitzrayim. This process, and he goes through it a little bit, and says this process of the putting on the doorposts was to create, we're going to leave the rest, but was to create this Shin and a Dalet and a Yud, those 3 letters, which represents Shomer Dalsos Yisrael. So he says, but because the Jewish people didn't have the Torah yet, Hashem couldn't give them yet the mitzvah of mezuzah, he gave them the next best thing.
The door of Jews, is that what it means?
Shomer Dalet, right. So he gave them the next best thing. He says, just like Avraham had Eliezer hold him by the milah, because that was the mitzvah which he had, the Jewish people didn't have any mezuzahs to put up, but they had a mitzvah to put up. And so they put the mitzvah of the Pesach, not the blood. It wasn't about the blood. It was about the representation of the mitzvah. They put that on the doors. Okay, let's leave it here if you want to take a look at the rest
so
of
the
the
mezuzah
Miram.
presents the shadim from coming in your house?
Right.
Okay,
right,
so why did it reverse the order instead of
So that's at the end of that piece. We unfortunately didn't get to it.
If that's the case,